This video, we are going to talk about the central nervous system, which remember is the brain and the spinal cord. So we're going to begin with a short discussion of brain development. There's not a lot of words that you're going to be responsible for, but I thought it would be interesting if we looked at week 5, first of all, and you can see a lot of these encephalon words. The main one that I want you to be responsible for is diencephalon, because that's going to remain in the adult brain. We also see the midbrain, which is going to be part of the brain stem in the future, as well as the spinal cord. So let's look at what happens during week 5. We have the telencephalon, diencephalon, mesencephalon, metencephalon, myelencephalon, midbrain, cervical flexures, and spinal cord. But again, this is not an embryology class, so you're not going to learn the majority of the names, just diencephalon, midbrain, and of course, spinal cord. When we get to week 3 of development, we're starting to see more of a brain start to appear here. And the midbrain has the cerebral hemispheres. Typically, the cerebral hemispheres are going to be the highest level of function, or what is thought of as the executive function of our brains. We have an outline of the diencephalon, which we'll talk more about. The midbrain, cerebellum, pons, medulla oblongata, and the spinal cord. So let's take a look at some of those structures listed here for week 3. We have that cerebral hemisphere, that executive function. The diencephalon, midbrain, cerebellum, pons, medulla oblongata, and the spinal cord as well. The diencephalon is going to make up several parts. It's going to include lots of the thalami. I like to think of them. So, for example, the epithalamus, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and then also part of the retina, which we'll be talking a lot more about later on. The mesencephalon up here is what becomes the midbrain. The metencephalon develops into the pons and cerebellum, and the myelencephalon develops into the medulla oblongata. If you're interested, again, you'll need to know those specific words. And down here, what we finally see is at birth, what will become the adult brain. So the cerebral hemispheres, which are the executive part of the brain, essentially, the diencephalon, which has all of these thalami. So it has the epithalamus, and the most important part of that is the pineal gland, the thalamus, and we're going to talk about the functions of all of these different ones, as well as the hypothalamus. We have the cerebellum below that, which is in the very posterior portion of our brain. And the cerebellum kind of controls things like motor coordination. So if somebody has something called cerebellar ataxia, that means they can't walk in a straight line. And then finally, at the base of the brain, we have the brainstem, which includes the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. These 3 structures are going to be for more automatic reflexes. And we'll talk about each of these individually as well. So the adult pattern is going to have these convolutions: cerebral hemisphere, diencephalon, cerebellum, midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. So let's look at the organization of the brain now. So first of all, we're taking a frontal or a coronal section here, and we are blowing it up. In this image, we can see the central cavity, specifically the lateral ventricles. And the ventricles are hollow spaces, and those hollow spaces are filled with cerebrospinal fluid, abbreviated as CSF. The white matter is going to be important tracts or axons that are present in the brain. The gray matter is called basal nuclei, and they are essentially cell bodies and dendrites. And then the outermost part, the sort of the bark of the cerebrum, is what's called the cerebral cortex. So we can see the cortex here. So the cerebrum and the cerebellum have islands of gray matter, which are called basal nuclei. And we'll be talking about a lot of them throughout the semester. Returning back to our original brain here, if we take a transverse or cross section here at right kind of below the brain stem, we're going to see the brain stem. You'll see this image later on in the lecture notes. There is a central cavity, which is the fourth ventricle. And again, that is filled with cerebral spinal fluid. There's inner gray matter and outer white matter. But the brain stem has additional regions of gray matter, brain nuclei, that have specific functions, as you'll learn about later on in the lecture notes. So this is a cross section of the spinal cord. And I want you to notice how it's kind of organized differently than the brain. For one thing, we don't have the gray matter on the outside. Instead, we have white matter. And this inner gray matter, it sort of has this butterfly shape to it. So that'll help you in lab when you're identifying it. In the very center of the spinal cord is a spinal canal, which is called the central canal. And it's an extension of the ventricular system, which is in the brain. So the spinal cord exhibits kind of a basic pattern, a central canal surrounded by gray matter and then outer white matter. This chart is very important for you to remember in the future and for the rest of this unit. So I can't really emphasize it enough. But gray matter is neuron cell bodies, which remember are also called soma, and short non-myelinated neurons, as well as dendrites. That's quite different than white matter, because white matter has myelinated axons with some non-myelinated axons. So remember, the big difference here with the white matter is that they have myelin present. So there's a lot that information that you can glean from whether or not the myelin is present